My name is Arthur Penhaligon. It is a name that, until recently, I associated with the quiet, dignified scent of old paper and binding glue, with the hushed reverence of university archives. For 12 years, I was a junior academic, a man whose life was measured in footnotes and bibliographic entries. My dissertation, a dense and, I must admit, rather self-indulgent treatise on pre-Christian harvest rituals in isolated European communities, now seems like a bitter joke, a theoretical exploration of a reality I was wholly unprepared to confront. The world of academia, however, is not sustained by passion, but by endowments and enrollment figures. When the budget cuts came, they were swift and merciless, and my position, deemed non-essential, was excised with the cold precision of a surgeon removing a benign but useless tumor. I found myself adrift at 38, overeducated for manual labor and under-qualified for the cutthroat corporate world. The quiet suffocation of my small apartment, filled with books that were now just monuments to a failed career, became unbearable. It was in this state of quiet desperation that I began searching for an escape, not just from my circumstances, but from myself. I harbored a romantic, almost scholarly, notion of returning to the land, of engaging in a more authentic existence. I imagined a life of honest sweat and tangible results, a stark contrast to the esoteric and ultimately fruitless intellectualism that had defined me. The advertisement was not found on some ubiquitous job-seeking website. I discovered it tucked away in the classified section of the Modern Tiller, a niche agricultural journal I subscribed to out of a lingering academic interest. The notice was laughably brief, almost cryptic. Farmhand needed for remote, private estate, room and board provided. Generous stipend, long-term commitment required. Experience not necessary, but diligence is paramount. Call for interview. There was only a phone number, no address, no company name. The very oddity of it appealed to the part of me that had spent years chasing obscure folklore. I called. The voice on the other end belonged to a man who introduced himself only as Mr. Helm. The interview, if one could call it that, lasted less than 5 minutes. He asked no questions about my farming experience, of which I had none. Instead, he asked if I was a man who could follow instructions without question, if I was comfortable with solitude, and if I had any immediate family or dependents. My answers, yes, yes, and no, seemed to satisfy him. He offered me the position on the spot, the terms non-negotiable. I was to be paid a stipend that was, as advertised, surprisingly generous. My duties, he said, would be made clear upon my arrival. He gave me directions, a series of county roads and unmarked turns that I meticulously transcribed, and a date for my arrival 1 week hence. Then he hung up. There was no request for a resume, no background check, no follow-up email. It was a contract built on a handful of sentences and a blind leap of faith. I took it. It felt less like a choice and more like the only door that had opened in a long, featureless hallway. The journey to Blackwood Farm was a methodical peeling away of the modern world. The first hour was unremarkable highway driving, but as I followed Mr. Helm's directions, the roads began to narrow. 4 lanes became 2, then 2 became a single strip of cracked asphalt fringed with weeds. The reassuring bars of my phone's signal dwindled, wavered, and then vanished entirely. The landscape transformed, the gentle, rolling hills of the countryside giving way to a denser, more primal forest. The trees, mostly ancient, dark-barked pines and skeletal birches, pressed in on the road, their branches interlocking overhead to form a gloomy tunnel. The sun, which had been bright and clear, now seemed distant. Its light filtered through the thick canopy, into a perpetual twilight. The final turn was onto an unmarked dirt road, little more than 2 ruts carved into the earth. My car, a sensible sedan utterly unsuited for such terrain, groaned in protest as it bounced and scraped over rocks and roots. The woods were so close now I could have reached out and touched the moss-covered bark. It was here that I first noticed the silence. Not the peaceful quiet of the countryside, but a profound and unnatural stillness. There were no birds singing in the trees, no squirrels chattering, no insects buzzing in the humid air. The only sounds were the complaining engine of my car and the whisper of the wind through the pines. A sound like a drawn-out, mournful sigh. After another mile that felt like 10, the road opened into a clearing. Before me stood a rusted iron gate, flanked by stone pillars that were being slowly consumed by ivy. A simple, hand-painted wooden sign was wired to the bars. It read "Arm, Delaras by Apulak No challenge. The gate was unlocked. I pushed it open, its hinges screaming in protest, and drove through, pulling up in front of a large, weathered farmhouse. At first glance, the farm was deceptively normal. The 2-story house was clad in faded white clapboard, with a wide porch and dark green shutters. To its left stood a massive barn, its wood weathered to a silvery gray, and behind it, the conical top of a silo rose against the bruised, purple sky. Fields of what looked like corn, their stalks tall and dense, stretched away on all sides, disappearing into the dark wall of the surrounding forest. Yet the oppressive, unnatural silence persisted, blanketing the entire property. It felt less like a place of cultivation and more like a place holding its breath. As I stepped out of my car, the front door of the farmhouse opened, and an elderly couple emerged onto the porch. They moved in perfect tandem, as if yoked together by some invisible force. The man, whom I presumed to be Mr. Helm, was tall and gaunt, his frame like a scarecrow's beneath his simple denim overalls. His face was a roadmap of deep wrinkles, and his hands, which hung loosely at his sides, were large and gnarled, looking less like flesh and more like unearthed roots. The woman, Mrs. Helm, was shorter and plumper, wearing a simple, high-colored calico dress. She offered a smile, but it was a fixed, brittle thing that did not touch the cold stillness of her pale blue eyes. She watched me with an unblinking, unnervingly placid intensity. "Mr. Penhaligon," Mr. Helm stated. It was not a question. His voice was a low, gravelly rumble, like stones grinding together. "Yes, it's a pleasure to meet you," I said, extending a hand. He ignored it, his gaze sweeping over me and my car with a dispassionate, assessing air. "The cabin is that way," he said, pointing with his chin toward a small, simple structure nestled at the edge of the clearing, 100 yards from the main house. "Your things go there. Your work begins at sunrise." "Of course," I replied, feeling my formal pleasantries dissolving in the face of their stark functionality. "Will you be giving me a tour of the property?" Mrs. Helm's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "You'll learn what you need to know," she said, her voice surprisingly soft, yet carrying an odd, resonant quality. "The list is what matters." They watched in that profound silence as I retrieved my 2 suitcases from the trunk. Their clothing, I noted, was old-fashioned but meticulously clean, pressed and maintained with a rigor that suggested it was more of a uniform than a choice. As I started toward the cabin, Mr. Helm spoke again. "We do not run this farm as a business, Mr. Penhaligon," he said, and for the first time, there was a flicker of something other than stony indifference in his tone. "It is a responsibility, a great and terrible responsibility. Do you understand?" I did not understand, not in the slightest, but I nodded. I do. He gave a slow, deliberate nod in return, as if accepting my lie as a necessary part of our transaction. They turned as one and retreated back into the farmhouse, closing the door behind them without another word. I was left alone in the clearing, the silence rushing back in to fill the space their presence had occupied. The cabin was Spartan, a single room with a narrow bed, a small table with one chair, a wood-burning stove, and a bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. A small, adjoining bathroom contained a toilet and a shower stall. It was clean but stark, devoid of any personal touch. I unpacked my belongings, the few books I'd brought with me looking absurdly out of place on the rough-hewn table. As dusk began to bleed into the sky, casting long, distorted shadows across the yard, there was a sharp knock at my door. It was Mr. Helm, holding a single, yellowed sheet of paper. He held it out to me. "This is your contract," he said, his eyes boring into mine. "It is more important than the stipend. It is more important than the work itself. Memorize this, live by it. It's not about your wage, Mr. Penhaligon. It's about your survival." I took the paper from his hand. It was old, the corners soft with wear, and covered in neat, typewritten text. He gave me one last, long look before turning and walking back to the main house, his form swallowed by the encroaching darkness. I closed the door, slid the heavy bolt into place, and sat down at the table under the stark light of the single bulb. I read the list. Table 20, the rules of Blackwood Farm 1. Your workday is from sunrise to sunset. Be inside your cabin before the last light leaves the sky. Lock your door. 2. The livestock, 3 goats. 1 sow must be fed twice daily. Once at dawn, once at noon. Never at night. Count them each time you feed them. If the number is wrong, return to your cabin immediately and do not come out until dawn. 3. All tools must be cleaned of mud and soil and returned to the main shed by 5 p.m. Do not leave tools in the fields overnight. 4. The cornfield is off, limits after dusk. If you see a woman in a white dress among the stalks, do not look at her face. Turn around and walk away. Do not run. Her name is not Eleanor, and she does not want your help. 5. You will hear singing from the woods some nights. It may sound like a lullaby. Cover your ears or use the provided earplugs. Do not listen to the words. 6. The main farmhouse is our private residence. Do not approach it after we have retired for the evening, unless there is a fire. 7. The generator behind the barn powers the property. It must never run out of fuel. The reserve cans are in the main shed. 8. Never, under any circumstances, enter the root cellar. The door is bolted for a reason. We will handle what is inside. 9. If you find a small, carved wooden doll in the fields, do not touch it. Leave it where it lies and inform Mr. Helm at once. 10. Once a week, on a day we specify, you will leave a bowl of fresh milk on the large, flat stone at the edge of the woods. You will do this at noon and retrieve the empty bowl the following morning. Do not watch to see what drinks it. I read the list once, then twice, then a third time. A part of my mind, the rational, academic part, tried to file it all away as the harmless, paranoid eccentricities of 2 old farmers who had lived in isolation for too long. Rule Feint 3 was practical. Rule Phase 6 was a simple request for privacy. However, the others felt like they had been lifted directly from the kind of obscure, regional folk tales I used to study. The woman in the cornfield, the forbidden lullaby, the offering of milk. They were all recognizable archetypes, warnings against angering the genius loci, the spirit of a place. It was fascinating. It was absurd. I felt a strange mix of clinical curiosity and a deep, creeping unease. I folded the paper and placed it on the table, my mind racing to deconstruct the Helms psychology. This was a system they had created to make sense of their lonely world, a set of superstitions to ward off the fear of the dark woods and the deep silence. That had to be it. Deep night fell. The darkness outside the cabin's single window was absolute, a solid wall of black. I tried to read one of my books, but the words wouldn't cohere. My ears strained against the silence, listening for, I wasn't sure what. And then I heard it. It started so faintly I thought it was the wind. But it wasn't the wind. It was a melody, drifting from the direction of the woods. It was a lullaby, just as the list had warned. The tune was simple, beautiful, and achingly sad. It was sung by a woman's voice, a voice so pure and clear it seemed to bypass my ears and resonate directly inside my skull. It felt intimate, like a half-remembered song from my own childhood, yet it was utterly alien. The sound seemed to pull at my attention, promising comfort, promising answers. I found myself leaning toward the window, wanting to hear the words, wanting to understand the source of the beautiful, heartbreaking sound. Rule Feint 5. Cover your ears, do not listen to the words. Mr. Helms' warning. It's about your survival, slammed into my consciousness with the force of a physical blow. A cold spike of adrenaline shot through me. This wasn't a folk tale. This wasn't a superstition. This was real. With trembling hands, I scrambled through my luggage, found my noise, canceling earbuds, and jammed them into my ears. The beautiful melody was muffled, but I could still feel its vibration in my bones. My heart hammered against my ribs. I retreated from the window, backing away until my shoulders hit the far wall of the cabin and slid to the floor. I sat there for what felt like hours, huddled in the stark light of the single bulb, listening to the muffled, alien melody that had promised comfort but delivered only a pristine and undiluted terror. The list was not a joke. The contract was real, and I had already survived my first night. Sleep did not come. I dozed in fits and starts, slumped in the chair, the list of rules on the table before me like a holy text. The academic in me was gone, replaced by a more primal creature who understood that the lullaby had not been a psychological quirk, but a predator's call. When the first, weak light of dawn finally filtered through the grimy window pane, it felt less like a new day and more like a temporary ceasefire. The silence had returned, but it was different now. It was not empty. It was waiting. My body ached with a tension I had never known. Every nerve felt frayed, exposed. I forced myself to my feet, my movements stiff. The first rule dictated my schedule. Your workday is from sunrise to sunset. The sun was rising. My work had begun. I stepped out of the cabin into the cool, damp air. The farm was bathed in a soft, gray light. Mist clung to the ground, swirling around the bases of the barn and the silo. I walked toward the barn, my boots sinking slightly into the dark, rich soil. The air smelled of wet earth, of hay, and of something else, a faint, cloying sweetness that I couldn't place. Inside the barn, the air was thick with the scent of animals and old wood. The 3 goats regarded me with intelligent, unnervingly yellow eyes. The sow, a massive creature of pink flesh and bristly hair, grunted from her pen. Rule Feint feed them twice daily, count them each time. I measured out the feed, my hands clumsy. 1, 2, 3 goats. 1 sow. The numbers were correct. A small, pathetic wave of relief washed over me. I filled their troughs, the simple, physical labor a welcome distraction. As I worked, I noticed something odd. The barn was cavernous, with haylofts lost in the gloom above, but the animals were confined to a small, sectioned off area near the main doors. The entire back half of the barn was empty, save for a thick layer of dust and a single, heavy door secured with a massive iron bolt. It looked similar to the one on the root cellar. Another forbidden space. As I emerged from the barn, blinking in the strengthening light, Mr. Helm was standing there, as if he had materialized from the mist. He held a pair of heavy work gloves and a post hole digger. "The fence along the west field needs mending," he said, his voice as flat and gray as the morning. "The posts are rotting. Replace them. The new posts are stacked by the shed." He handed me the equipment. "Today is the day for the offering," I swallowed. "The offering? The milk," he said, his eyes holding mine. "Mrs. Helm will have it for you at noon. Do not be late." He looked past me toward the endless rows of corn that bordered the west field. "And keep your wits about you out there. The corn listens." He then turned and walked away, leaving me with the tools and his cryptic warning. The work was grueling. The soil was rocky beneath the surface, and digging the holes for the new fence posts was a sweaty, back-breaking affair. But I welcomed it. The pain in my muscles was real, tangible. It was a feeling I could understand. The fence line ran directly beside the cornfield, and Mr. Helm's words echoed in my mind. The corn was unnaturally tall for the season, well over 8 feet, and impossibly dense. The stalks grew so close together that just a few feet in, the rows were plunged into a green, suffocating darkness. The wind rustled through the leaves, creating a constant, whispering shush that sounded like hushed, indistinct conversations. More than once, I would hear a rustle close by and spin around, my heart pounding, only to see nothing but the shifting wall of green. It was while I was wrestling a particularly stubborn rock from a hole that my hand brushed against something in the dirt. It wasn't a stone. It was small and hard, with a strange texture. I pulled it free. It was a small, crudely carved wooden doll, no bigger than my palm. Its limbs were stick, like its head a simple knob of wood, but someone had etched a face into it, 2 gouged out holes for eyes and a wide, screaming mouth. The wood was dark, almost black, and felt strangely warm to the touch. Rule Fade 9A. If you find a small, carved wooden doll in the fields, do not touch it. Leave it where it lies and inform Mr. Helm at once. I had already touched it. I had picked it up. A jolt of pure panic, cold and sharp, shot through me. I dropped the doll as if it were red hot, scrambling back from the fence post. My breath hitched in my chest. I stared at the obscene little object lying in the dirt, its silent scream aimed at the sky. I had broken a rule. What now? My mind raced. I could put it back, pretend I never saw it, but Mr. Helm's face swam into my vision. Gaunt, serious, his words echoing. "It's about your survival." Hiding a mistake seemed infinitely more dangerous than admitting to one. With my heart hammering, I abandoned my tools and ran, not walked, toward the farmhouse. I found him in the main shed, sharpening a scythe with a wet stone. The rhythmic shing-shing, shing of the stone on the blade stopped as I skidded to a halt in the doorway, panting. "I found one," I gasped. "A doll. By the west fence." I touched it before I remembered. The color, what little there was, drained from Mr. Helm's face. He set the scythe down with unnerving care. He did not look angry. He looked afraid. "Show me," he commanded, his voice tight. I led him back to the fence line. The doll was still there. Mr. Helm did not approach it. He stared at it from a distance, his lips a thin, white line. From his pocket, he produced a square of thick, dark cloth. He carefully knelt, used the cloth to pick up the doll without his skin making contact, and wrapped it tightly. "The ground is hungry, Mr. Penhaligon," he said, his voice low and strained. and you have offered it an invitation." He straightened up, holding the wrapped object away from his body. "Finish your work. Then go to your cabin. Do not be late for the offering." He turned and strode away, not toward the farmhouse, but toward the dark, silent woods. I worked with frantic energy after that, my fear a new source of fuel. At 5 minutes to noon, I returned to the yard. Mrs. Helm was waiting on the porch, holding a simple earthenware bowl, filled to the brim with creamy white milk. Her placid smile was fixed in place, but her eyes, I thought, held a flicker of something new. "Pity. The stone at the edge of the woods," she said softly. "You know the one. Walk directly there. Do not look behind you. Leave the bowl. Walk directly back." I took the bowl from her. It was surprisingly heavy. I walked across the clearing, past my cabin, toward the line of trees that marked the farm's border. Just as she'd said, there was a large, flat-topped boulder nestled among the ferns, its surface worn smooth by time and weather. The air here was cooler, the silence deeper. I could feel the immense, ancient weight of the forest pressing in. I carefully placed the bowl in the center of the stone. The white of the milk was a stark contrast to the dark, moss-covered rock. I did as I was told, turning my back on the offering and walking away without a backward glance. I felt 1,000 unseen eyes on my back. I had just paid a tax, a tithe, to a landlord I could not see. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of anxious labor. As the sun began its descent, painting the sky in shades of orange and blood red, I frantically cleaned my tools and returned them to the shed, my mind on Rule 23 and the approaching deadline of 5 p.m. I finished with minutes to spare. My final task was to check the generator behind the barn, ensuring the fuel was topped off. As I rounded the corner of the massive structure, my eyes were drawn to the cornfield, and I saw her. It was not a clear sighting. It was a flicker of movement, a flash of white deep within the green labyrinth of the corn. A shape, the shape of a woman in a long, white dress, moving between the stalks. She was maybe 50 yards away, her form obscured by the dense leaves, but she was unmistakably there. My blood ran cold. I froze, my hand on the generator. My first instinct was to stare, to try and get a better look, to let my academic curiosity overwhelm my primal fear. Who was she? What did she want? Rule 24. If you see a woman in a white dress among the stalks, do not look at her face. Turn around and walk away. Do not run. The words on the list were a lifeline. I tore my gaze away, my neck muscles screaming in protest. I did not check the generator. I did not run. I turned, my body stiff with terror, and began to walk. Each step was a monumental effort of will. I walked at a steady, deliberate pace back toward my cabin, my eyes fixed on the door, as if it were the only point of salvation in the entire world. The rustling of the corn seemed to grow louder, closer, as if it were right behind me. It sounded like the whisper of a dress dragging through dry leaves. I did not look back. I reached my cabin as the last sliver of sun disappeared below the horizon. I stumbled inside, slammed the door, and threw the bolt. My body was trembling uncontrollably. I collapsed into the chair, my head in my hands. The list lay on the table. It was no longer a set of rules from a strange employer. It was a shield. Each rule was a defense against a specific, targeted threat. The lullaby that charmed, the doll that invited, the woman who watched. I was not a farmhand. I was a sentry on a permanent, terrifying watch, and I had just learned that the things I was guarding against were not just in the woods. They were in the fields. They were everywhere, and they were waiting for me to make one wrong move. The bolt on my cabin door felt flimsy, a trivial piece of metal against the vast, listening darkness. I spent another night in the chair, the list of rules my only companion. Sleep was a luxury I could no longer afford. Every creak of the cabin's old wood, every sigh of the wind, was a potential threat to be analyzed. My former life as an academic felt like a dream, a story about someone else. That man, Arthur Penhaligon, had studied rituals. This new man, this hollowed-out shell, was living inside one. Dawn arrived not with relief, but with a new set of obligations. My first task, according to the rhythm the rules had imposed on my life, was to retrieve the empty milk bowl from the offering stone. The thought filled me with a quiet dread. I had left it for something unseen, and now I had to collect the evidence of its visit. The morning air was thick and heavy. As I approached the edge of the woods, the silence felt more profound than ever. The bowl was sitting on the flat stone, just as I had left it. It was empty. I picked it up, and my fingers recoiled. The inside of the earthenware bowl was coated with a thin, dark, sticky residue. It was almost black, with a faint, coppery smell that reminded me of old blood and damp soil. It was not the clean, licked bowl I had expected. Something had drunk the milk, but it had left a part of itself behind. I held the bowl away from my body, a deep, instinctual revulsion crawling up my spine. I took it to the outdoor water pump and scrubbed it relentlessly, the dark residue swirling away into the dirt, staining the ground for a moment before vanishing. My next task was to feed the livestock. I counted them as I entered the barn, the litany now a desperate prayer. 1, 2, 3 goats. 1 sow. The numbers were correct. The relief was so intense it left me dizzy. Mr. Helm found me as I was leaving the barn. He looked haggard, older than he had the day before. There were dark circles under his eyes. He didn't mention the doll I had found, but it hung in the air between us, an unspoken sin. The silo, he said, his voice raspy. The auger is jamming, needs to be cleared, and the grain levels checked. He gestured with his chin toward the tall, cylindrical structure that loomed over the farm. Be careful. It's a long way down. The silo was a place of shadows and dust. A single, grimy window high above let in a weak shaft of light that illuminated swirling dust motes, making them look like a galaxy of tiny, dead stars. The air was stale, thick with the smell of dry grain, and something else, the scent of mice. Perhaps, but older, muskier. A rickety wooden ladder was bolted to the interior wall, leading up into the darkness. I was not eager to climb it, but the thought of displeasing Mr. Helm was worse. As I began my ascent, my hand brushed against the rough concrete of the silo wall. I felt markings. I paused, running my fingers over them. They were carvings etched deep into the concrete. They were not random scratches. There were spirals, concentric circles, and a recurring symbol that made the hair on my arms stand up, a stylized eye, wide and unblinking. It was a symbol I recognized. I had seen variations of it in my research, in dusty tomes describing pre-Roman cults in Gaul and the British Isles. It was often associated with deities of the harvest, of the soil, of the things that slumbered beneath the earth. Seeing it here, carved into the wall of this forgotten silo, felt like a violation, a piece of ancient, malevolent history bleeding into the present. My dissertation was no longer a joke. It was a field guide to my own damnation. Shaken, I finished my task, clearing a clog of damp grain from the auger mechanism and estimating the remaining supply. I descended the ladder as quickly as I dared, eager to be out of that dusty tomb and back in the open air. As I walked back toward the farmhouse, a sound stopped me dead in my tracks. It was faint, but unmistakable. A rhythmic thump, thump, coming from the ground. I pinpointed its source, the slanted, heavy wooden doors of the root cellar, set into a small mound of earth a few yards from the main house. Rule I never, under any circumstances, enter the root cellar. The door is bolted for a reason. We will handle what is inside. My academic curiosity warred with the stark terror the rules had instilled in me. The thumping was steady, methodical. It wasn't the sound of an animal scrabbling. It sounded deliberate. I took a few cautious steps closer. The cellar doors were secured with a thick, rusted iron bar, just as the list implied. A palpable cold seemed to radiate from them, a damp cellar chill that had no business being there on a warm day. I leaned closer, straining to hear. The thumping stopped. The silence that followed was somehow more menacing. It is not for you to worry about. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat. Mrs. Helm stood right behind me. I hadn't heard her approach. Her feet had made no sound on the soft earth. Her face wore its usual placid, unreadable smile, but her eyes were hard, cold as river stones. The earth has its needs, she said, her soft voice carrying an unnerving weight. She held out a small, cloth-wrapped bundle. You missed your midday meal. Eat. I took the bundle with a trembling hand. It was a thick slice of dark, heavy bread, still warm. It smelled of molasses and rye. Thank you, I stammered, backing away from the cellar doors. The soil gives, Mr. Penhaligon, she said, her gaze drifting from me to the bolted doors. And so it must be given to. That is the nature of the contract, the true contract. She turned and walked back to the farmhouse, leaving me alone with the humming silence and the warm bread in my hand. I had no appetite. I felt as though I had been caught eavesdropping on a secret I was never meant to know. The afternoon wore on. The sun beat down, creating a false sense of normalcy. The farm looked peaceful, bucolic. But I knew it was a facade, a carefully maintained stage for a play I did not understand. It was time for the noon feeding, or rather, the afternoon feeding, as my encounter at the silo had thrown my schedule into disarray. I walked to the barn, my mind a whirlwind of unblinking eyes, carved in concrete and the cold that emanated from the ground. I opened the barn door, the familiar scent of hay and animals washing over me. I began the ritual, the count that had become my shield. 1 sow, I murmured, scooping feed into her trough. Then I turned to the goats. My eyes scanned the pen. 2, 3, I stopped. My blood turned to ice water in my veins. There were 4. Standing amongst the 3 familiar tan and white goats was a 4th. It was a kid, small and unnaturally still. Its coat was the color of jet, a light, swallowing black. It wasn't bleeding or moving. It just stood there, nestled between the other goats, who seemed utterly oblivious to its presence. I stared, my mind refusing to process what I was seeing. I had counted them this morning. There were 3. There had always been 3. I took a hesitant step closer. The kid lifted its head and looked directly at me. Its eyes were not the placid, rectangular, pupilled yellow of the other goats. They were round, intelligent, and entirely black. There was no white, no iris, just 2 orbs of polished, depthless darkness that seemed to reflect my own terrified face. Rule Fay 2. Count them each time you feed them. If the number is wrong, return to your cabin immediately and do not come out until dawn. The rule screamed in my head, a klaxon of pure terror. The sun was still high in the sky. It was barely 3 in the afternoon, but the number was wrong. The rule was absolute. I did not feed them. I dropped the scoop, the grain spilling across the dusty floor. I began to back away, my eyes locked on the black kid. It did not move. It simply watched me with its terrible, knowing eyes. I turned and fled from the barn. my heart hammering against my ribs with a frantic, painful rhythm. I didn't run, but my walk was a desperate, clipped pace. I crossed the yard under the bright, indifferent sun, the world seeming to tilt on its axis. I reached my cabin, fumbled with the key, and threw myself inside, slamming the door and ramming the bolt home. I scrambled to the window, peering out. The farm looked exactly as it had moments before. Peaceful, sunny, deceptively normal. But I was now a prisoner, trapped not by the night, but by the rules. The sanctuary had become a cage. What were the Helms doing? Did they know? What was that thing in the barn? I was locked in my cabin until the next sunrise, a long, terrifying stretch of daylight and darkness ahead of me. The silence outside the window was no longer just waiting. It was watching. And for the first time, I understood that the horrors of Blackwood Farm did not just come out at night. They were always here. The hours of daylight I was forced to spend in the cabin were a unique form of torture. The sunlit world outside the window was a mockery. I watched as the afternoon shadows stretched and warped, turning familiar shapes into monstrous caricatures. From my window, I saw Mr. Helm emerge from the farmhouse. He walked not to the barn, but to the root cellar. He slid the heavy iron bar free and lifted one of the slanted doors. A wave of black, damp air seemed to billow out, visible even from my vantage point. He descended into the earth and was gone for nearly an hour. When he re-emerged, his face was pale as bone, and he moved with the slow, stiff gait of a man who has looked upon something soul-crushingly awful. He bolted the door and returned to the house without a single glance in my direction. Later, as the sun began to dip toward the horizon, Mrs. Helm walked to the barn. She carried an empty bucket. She was inside for a long time. When she came out, she was no longer carrying the bucket. And through the grimy pane of my window, I could see that her hands and the cuffs of her simple calico dress were stained with a dark, wet crimson. She, too, returned to the house. The black goat with the depthless eyes was a sacrifice. A sacrifice to what? Or for what? My mind, frayed and panicked, began to connect the dots. The offering of milk, the doll that invited the hungry ground, the thumping from the cellar, the unblinking eyes carved in the silo, the woman in the corn. It wasn't a collection of disparate superstitions. It was a system, a complex, interlocking mechanism of ritual and appeasement designed to keep something at bay, or perhaps to keep it fed. The last light of the sun vanished. The farm plunged into an inky, moonless darkness, and then a new horror. The steady, reassuring chug of the generator behind the barn sputtered, coughed, and died. Rule Phase 7. The generator must never run out of fuel. My blood ran cold with the realization. When I had seen the woman in the corn, I had turned and walked away, just as the rule dictated. But in my terror, I had forgotten my final task. I had not checked the generator. I had not refueled it. A cascade of failure. One broken rule leading to the violation of another. The single bare bulb in my cabin flickered and went out, plunging me into absolute blackness. The silence that followed was heavier, more profound than any I had yet experienced. It was the silence of a tomb, and out of that silence, the singing began. It was not the distant, mournful lullaby from the woods. This was closer. It was coming from the cornfield just beyond my window. It was the same beautiful, heartbreaking melody, but the voice was filled with a terrible, immediate hunger. It was the woman in white. She was singing for me. I scrambled away from the window, my hands scrabbling against the rough wooden walls of the cabin. Then came a new sound, a soft, rhythmic scratching at the door. Scrape, scrape, scrape. It was not the sound of an animal. It was deliberate, methodical. The sound of a long fingernail dragging slowly across the wood. My mind finally shattered. The academic, the farmhand, they were both gone, burned away by pure terror. All that was left was a cornered animal. I needed to see. I needed to know what was coming for me. I crawled to the window, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. I peered out into the suffocating darkness, and I saw them. The Helms were standing on their porch, side by side, illuminated by the faint, flickering glow of a lantern they held. They were not looking at the cornfield or at the source of the scratching. They were looking directly at my cabin. Their faces were impassive, their expressions not of malice, but of solemn, priestly observance. They were not my employers. They were my wardens, and my sentence was up. Then I saw her, emerging from the edge of the cornfield, a pale figure in a white dress, gliding over the ground. The lullaby grew louder, clearer, and now I could hear the words. They were not words of comfort. They were words of summoning, of offering, of an ancient and terrible pact. Rule Fay 4. Do not look at her face. But I couldn't look away. She turned toward my cabin, and I saw it. Her face was a pale, luminous oval, but it was the eyes that held me. They were not eyes at all, but two dark, hollow sockets from which the unnatural silence of the farm seemed to pour. And her mouth was open in a silent scream, a mirror of the carved doll I had found in the field. Behind her, the corn stalks rustled and parted, not from the wind, but from a presence. Something vast and dark was moving through the field, a shape of pure shadow, a form that the mind could not hold. It was the thing from beneath the soil, the thing that drank the milk and slept in the cold cellar. It was the god with the unblinking eye. In that final, lucid moment of terror, I understood everything. The advertisement for a man with no family, the long-term commitment, the great and terrible responsibility. I was not the first. I was merely the latest in a long line of hired hands. We were not there to work the farm. We were the true crop. The scratching at my door stopped. It was replaced by a tremendous, splintering crash as the wood gave way. The lullaby was inside the cabin with me now, filling the small space with its awful, beautiful sound. My name is Arthur Penhaligon. I was an academic who specialized in pre-Christian harvest rituals. My dissertation argued that ancient communities believed the spirit of the grain, the very life, force of the land, required a human sacrifice to ensure a bountiful harvest, a life for a life. The soil gives, and so it must be given to. I was wrong about one thing. It wasn't a belief. It's a contract. And the harvest is here.